All right. Revelation chapter 13 is actually where we're technically starting this morning, but I did want to pick up where we left off last week. Joe had asked a question that I think I misunderstood in the moment. I mentioned as we kind of went through Revelation 12 here that we kind of transition a bit from talking about this great dragon to talking about the serpent. And I mentioned how later on, all of a sudden, now the reference is to the serpent, not so much to the dragon. Starting, for instance, in verse 14, you see how the woman is taken away from the presence of the serpent. And I mentioned the fact that this might signify the kind of a knocking down of Satan, which indeed is what's happening. But Joe rightly asked the question that if the reference to the serpent kind of goes all the way back to the garden, then at what point did he kind of take on this form of the great dragon and then go back to being a serpent? And he's right to point that out. So I suggest that maybe simply the reference to the serpent, as opposed to any kind of reference of being kind of knocked down a stage, so to speak, which, although that is happening, the reference to the serpent simply is a reminder that he is the deceiver. He is the one that was in the garden with Adam and Eve. He is the one that from the beginning has through his influence, has brought sin into the world. And that doesn't change. His goal, his purpose hasn't changed ever. And his whole goal is to try to disrupt the plan of God. And to that end, therefore, he seeks to disrupt the people of God. And so I hope that does that more appropriately address the question you asked, Joe? I think that kind of was after going back and watching it a little bit, and I realized what Joe was actually asking, and I misunderstood there at the end of class last week. So I wanted to pick up on that and kind of make that kind of address that a little bit. So going on to chapter 13, we finished our questions for chapter 12 last week, and we discussed kind of this dragon, this great dragon representative of Satan, as it's expressly pointed out. And the fact that Satan is going through a bit of turmoil here because of what Jesus accomplished. Through his death, burial, and resurrection, ascension into heaven, Satan has now been taken off that stage of power and authority that he once was allowed to have. Jesus has bound him to an extent that now he no longer is able to do many of the things that he was able to do before. But he still has influence. And this is part of that. He knows he only has a short time that we read back in chapter 12. There is still one kind of last bastion of imposed idol worship and, to a certain extent, emperor worship as well within the Roman Empire. And this was like we talked about with the churches of Asia, especially, for instance, with we talked about not Laodicea. It was the last one of Revelation, chapter 2, I think it was. Smyrna was the one I was thinking of. Smyrna, the church at Smyrna, and how that Smyrna kind of represented all these had all these guilds and so forth that were associated with that city. It was a place of trade and a place of commerce. But Christians, if they didn't have their certificate showing that they had offered their yearly libation and made their yearly confession of Caesar as Lord, they weren't allowed to do business with guilds. And so there's a very real aspect of circumstances involved in what Satan was able to accomplish through the Roman Empire and his influence on this imposition of idol worship and Caesar worship. That's going to play a big part here in chapter 13. Because here in chapter 13, we're introduced to two beasts. One is of the sea, and then the second one, or the second half of chapter 13, is of the land, or of the earth. The first part of the notes deals with this first beast. The second part, which those notes are out here on the table now, deals with the second beast. But starting here in verse 1 of chapter 13, then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now, it's notable, and I mentioned this from Haley's commentary regarding kind of the introduction to chapter 13. He says, here is a plain introduction of the Roman Empire as an instrument of Satan's diabolical and blasphemous power, cruelty, and opposition to God's kingdom. In the mighty worldwide Roman Empire was combined the tearing power of the Chaldea, the crushing force of Medo-Persia, and the swift and ferocious character of Macedonia under Alexander. This beast symbolized all the anti-God opposition by force that could ever be brought against the people of God. But to John and the saints to whom he wrote, it definitely personified the empire of their day. And that kind of served as an introduction to chapter 3. And that idea, as we go forward here in chapter 13, or I'm sorry, I said chapter 3, chapter 13, the idea going forward is look at the connection or kind of the relationship, how this beast is described compared to the great dragon. Okay, you've got multiple heads, you've got horns, you've got crowns. The fact that this beast is arising out of the sea is, to an extent, notable in that, like I said, we have the land or the earth is where the second beast kind of arose out of. But here in verse 1, this first beast arises out of the sea. In fact, it's the exact same concept that we find in Daniel chapter 7. Remember, Daniel chapter 7 has already come up multiple times, going back through chapter 12, regarding the different kingdoms of earth and how that this was prophesied way back in Daniel, that there would be a war against the saints in the times of this fourth kingdom, which represents the Roman Empire. And this is what was being referenced in Daniel 7. But Daniel chapter 7, verses 3 through 7, reference to the sea is made about it being kind of the sea of man. And out of the sea of man kind of arises these beasts or these empires. And it's representative of how that these empires, these world empires especially, which are under consideration in Daniel chapter 7, each one has taken on this form of power and authority, but also associated with each one. Did any of them serve Jehovah or acknowledge Jehovah as God? No. No, all of them had their own gods. And in all of those empires or kingdoms, those nations that arose that were world empires, at some point in time, their leaders or certain leaders were identified or worshipped as gods. Even among you go back as far as pharaohs, right, in Egypt, and how that those were recognized as the closest thing to gods as you could get. And in many of these cases, these kings were worshipped as gods. Nebuchadnezzar set up a statue of some form, whether it was a statue of himself or a statue of one of their gods, that he commanded Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in their time to worship, and they refused to do so. But here in verse 1, we find kind of out of this sea of humanity now has come another beast. Just like those beasts that are referenced in Daniel chapter 7, and each one of those had a certain form, which we'll talk about in just a second. Same forms are being referenced here. But he says this beast is rising up out of the sea and it has 7 heads. And we talked about the fact before about the term 7 and this idea of fullness and completion. Not from God's perspective, but from man's perspective. This is kind of a completed beast. It's a full empire. It's an empire that kind of contains all of the best of all of the past empires. And it has 10 horns. Now remember what horns represent. We talked about these horns, and especially in nature, the one who has the biggest horn usually ends up being the alpha, the leader. What do horns represent? Especially going back into the Psalms, the horn of our salvation. What does a horn represent? Power. Power. And so these heads, which as we associated with the great dragon or Satan, represents kind of this guile, this earthly wisdom, this earthly intelligence. And then you've got these horns, which represents power, the fact that there are 10 of them. It's not that they're any specific individual or any king. It's just representative of this idea of the power that the Roman Empire had. And then the fact that at the end of verse 1, on his horns were 10 crowns, and on its heads a blasphemous name. And it's really interesting because the idea of the 10 crowns, remember we talked about this term crown with the great dragon, and how that term is used never of the saints and the crown the saints would receive, but rather crown of kingly honor, okay, and respect. Now, only once Jesus has this crown because he is king. But in all other places here in Revelation, it's regarding the great dragon, regarding this first beast having these crowns. And these crowns, again, as we talk about, represent this kind of kingly authority, this royalty. And it is notable, in fact, several of the commentaries note it, but don't really offer any particular importance or any particular reason why. But with the first beast, with the great dragon, where were these crowns located? They were on his heads. Okay. With the great dragon, back in chapter 12, these crowns were located on his heads. Here, where are the crowns located? On the horns. And I suggest that given the fact that this kingly authority, this kingly royalty is being associated here, this respect and reverence as a result of it, again, from man's perspective, that it's designated kind of from where that authority, where that royalty comes from, or kind of from, again, from man's perspective. Whereas the power behind Satan is his guile, his intellect, thus his crowns are on his head, speaking to the idea of that kind of, that being prince of the earth, or prince of the power of the air, as Paul refers to him, the prince of this world, Jesus refers to him. That's that guile and intelligence and ability to influence for evil. However, the main thrust of the Roman Empire, the main power of the Roman Empire didn't exist in its guile and its intelligence, but rather its military might. And so when we talk about horns and that power, especially that physical ability to impose one's will through force, thus the crowns are on the horns of the Roman Empire here. That's how the empire enforced its will, is through its power, its might, through its military and the physical imposition of force, not so much through its intelligence and guile. And so I suggest that might be why here the crowns are on the horns as opposed to the dragon, or Satan, whose crowns are on his head. It's just a difference of how they operate. Satan operates in the background. He operates through intelligence and guile, whereas kingdoms of men, especially these world empires that existed, ultimately culminating in the Roman Empire, the way they functioned was through force. And that's how they kind of maintained their power. All right, so anything through that? Then on his head's a blasphemous name. It's not so much that there's any one particular name that's being referenced here, but more so the concept of a blasphemous reference. And the idea being associated here would seem to be that within it, just like every other previous world empire that had ever existed, it worshipped false gods, and in particular even exalted its own kings to almost a deity state. Starting with, and really you go back and you kind of look through the history of the Roman Empire and their leaders, it kind of started with Augustus. But even before that, there was even kind of a leaning towards exalting the Caesars as being more than just a man. And then gradually through the years, each one of these Caesars kind of gradually took more and more authority, more power, and claimed more deity until ultimately Domitian, which we'll talk about for the next set of notes. I include a note in there how that Domitian referred to himself as a living God. In fact, in his own writing, he would refer to himself as Master and Lord. And there's that deity aspect that he considered himself as having. And understanding that this is kind of the culmination of that the Roman Empire kind of represented that culmination of all of these different empires and their strengths, and that false idol worship helps explain these blasphemous names, or blasphemous name, that it pronounced itself as God to an extent. Thoughts or comments through verse 1? All right. So then in verse 2, and of course the idea of blasphemous name, there's going to be specific things we're going to notice in verse 6 as to what this beast is doing and how he's blaspheming the name of Jehovah. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But then in verse 2 it says, "Now the beast that I saw, or which I saw, was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority." And it's notable here that the very three animals that are referenced in Daniel chapter 7 regarding kind of the animals that best represented the character of the empires, the world empires that came. Just like Haley mentioned in his introduction, the Chaldeans kind of represented the lion and kind of that tearing power, that strength and authority. Then you had the crushing force of Medo-Persia, which was the bear, and then the ferocious and swift character of Macedonia as the leopard. And yet this one has all three. And that goes back to show, and it's an obvious callback to Daniel 7, the fact that those three animals are the same three animals Daniel sees in his vision in Daniel chapter 7. But this empire, notice that this is a beast that isn't related to any one animal, but it has characteristics of all three of the former. And it suggests kind of, again, taking kind of the best aspects of the different world empires that had existed before. And so that connection of, again, the swiftness and ferocity of a leopard, of the weight and power of a bear, and the kingship and courage of a lion. But what do all three have in common? What type of animals are they? They're predators. Okay, they're predators. And if you, especially in their day and time, if you met one of these in the wild, what were your chances of survival? Okay, very little. Very little. And so understanding that these were dangerous creatures. Now again, from the perspective of man, okay, these were attributes that they sought to have. Okay, they wanted their empire to be dangerous. They wanted their empire to be imposing. Thus, this world empire could impose its will on the whole world. But again, there's that very subtle underlying component here of it's not just a pleasing sense of strength and a reassuring sense of safety that maybe this empire provided, but there's a very real danger that exists within this beast. And that's why it's referred to as this wild beast or beast here in verse 2. Now, notice how the dragon, and who is the dragon? Satan. Okay, we know the dragon is Satan. Satan, the dragon, gave this beast his power, his throne, and great authority. How? What was it that made ultimately, and we'll even note this, the fact that it's not like the individuals a part of this empire knew whom they were actually serving. In serving the empire, in worshiping those false gods of the Roman and Greek pantheon, and of worshiping Caesar as God, who ultimately were they actually serving? Satan, the dragon. Okay, it is that influence that he was able to wield through a single world empire to impose the exact opposite of worship of Jehovah. Instead, it was the worship of these false gods. But then to go so far as anyone who refused to worship these false gods or worship Caesar as Lord were then executed or persecuted greatly. So we're talking about kind of this last grasp that Satan had in terms of, not to say that he doesn't still have influence, he absolutely does, but in the sense of imposing his influence on a single world empire. Never, ever again would Satan be allowed to do that. Ultimately, the Roman Empire was the last time Satan was allowed to have that type of influence over the entire world and to persecute to that extent those who sought to be faithful to God. Anything through verse 2. Verse 3. It says, I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world marveled and followed the beast. Now there's a lot made in commentaries about what is this mortal wound, because it's going to come up multiple times here in chapter 13, emphasizing that this is an important trait. This is an important characteristic. Now remember, he's got 7 heads. Okay? Now, the concept of the fact that he had 7 heads, again, we mentioned the fact that that number 7 represents the concept of fullness and completion, but the idea of having a head mortally wounded, but then to have it healed. So how many heads does he have? He had 7. One of those heads had been mortally wounded, and then his deadly wound was healed. It doesn't necessarily suggest that one of those heads was chopped off, but one of the heads received a mortal wound. Again, that sense of power and authority associated with the intelligence and understanding. But then it was healed, and all the world marveled and followed the beast. Some have tried to ascribe that event or that moment of mortal wounding as Nero, because there was a major event that happened when Nero committed suicide in 68 AD. The empire was thrown into chaos. In multiple succession, you had something like 4 different Caesars rise and are either assassinated or removed out of power. Some didn't even serve an entire year. So in rapid succession, you had multiple changes of Caesars. And some said, okay, well, that's Nero, and the thought process was at the time that the Roman Empire is beginning to fall. And it could be that that's the case, but keep in mind that one of the things that this beast represents is a culmination of all the world empires, and in particular the ones that were referenced in Daniel chapter 7. And so one of the, I guess, more symbolic aspects of this mortal wound, I kind of appreciated the imagery here, is the idea that this beast, it is embodied by this world empire of the Roman Empire, but it's referencing this cycle, how that each world empire would rise and then it would fall. Okay, and for a time, okay, that empire is gone, it's done, it's over with, it's been killed. But then what would inevitably happen? Another one takes its place. And then here's another same world, different world empire, maybe with different gods and different, ways of doing things, but still basically the same exact thing. Then that one would be conquered. And that's exactly what Daniel 7 is describing, how that each kingdom would come and then each kingdom would fall. These are world empires imposing their idolatrous will on the world, culminating finally in the Roman Empire. And so it was suggested that this concept of this mortal wound is the idea so much behind this kind of carrying on of Satan's purpose. That every time they think that it's been conquered, it's been done with, it's been killed, it's been put away, another one pops up in its place. And I kind of appreciate that from the perspective that not any one Caesar or any one necessarily event in the Roman Empire's history may be referred to here, but rather from a broader time scale, that it's a constant cycle, again, world empires that would finally end, because ultimately the beast is going to be destroyed. Okay, the beast is going to be judged and destroyed. That sense of authority, that sense of power of a single world empire is going to end with the Roman Empire. Never again would there ever be such an empire. But that's part of the reason why, verse 3, the world marveled. Every new empire, every new set of gods, every new king or whatnot, and off they go. The world marveled every time, and they followed the beast. Verse 4. So, but notice that they don't realize, I think it's implied here, they don't realize what they're doing. They worship the dragon who gave authority to the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like the beast, who is able to make war with him? Every world empire, especially the ones mentioned in Daniel chapter 7, I'm sure their citizens who were convinced that all was well, look at our power, look at our might, look at our knowledge and technology. Who can do anything to us? Who is like us? Who can go to war with us? And there was that sense of pride, but also that kind of sense of security that came with that. And I think there's a very real sense in which that kind of lulled each empire's groups of citizens and people into this false sense of security. Which, and of course, all these empires and all these world empires mentioned in Daniel 7, they eventually fell for different reasons. But as we talked before already in multiple chapters of Revelation, how that there were three main aspects of the fall of Rome. There was the internal corruption and the internal kind of devolving of of moral values. There was external from those who sought harm to the Roman Empire through raids and wars, and then there were natural events that kind of degraded the infrastructure of the Roman Empire. And over those three components ultimately led to the end of the Roman Empire as it used to exist at one time. From its peak, that's ultimately what brought it down. And so the idea that each one of these populations would say to themselves, look at how great our empire is. And some suggest that the beast is specifically Caesar, not necessarily one Caesar, but all the Caesars. And I don't think that necessarily fits within the broader sense of the fact that this beast contains, again, all these, the feet of a bear and so forth, as described here in verse 2, the feet of a bear, the beast was like the form of a leopard, his mouth was like the mouth of a lion. It seems to better be representative of the empire as a whole, regardless of which Caesar was in charge. The empire as a whole had this concept about it. And thus, verse 4, who's able to make war with our empire? Anything through verse 4? All right, verse 5. He was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months. Now, we've talked about this time frame of 42 months, which is the same as 3.5 years, which is the same as 1,260 days, or time times and half a time that Daniel chapter 7 references. And it is this period of time which this war, God allows this war against the saints to take place, being perpetuated by the great dragon, being actioned out through the Roman Empire and the persecution and killing of Christians. But it was a limited time. It was not allowed to continue forever, and God had already established an end where it would no longer be allowed. Thus, verse 5, notice he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. God allowed this to happen. Okay, God didn't do it. Again, all this came from Satan. Remember what the dragon is doing here, how the dragon gave him his power, verse 2, his throne and great authority. Well, this being given a mouth speaking great things, that comes from Satan. But God allows the Roman Empire, just like he allowed Pharaoh to receive praise as of a god and to exalt him to a point where Pharaoh is not going to accept the leaving of the Israelites. God allows these individuals like Nebuchadnezzar. Remember the great lesson Nebuchadnezzar had to learn, that God works in the kingdoms of men and he allows whom he will. He allows whoever he is going to serve his purpose to be in control of those things. Well, God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to take the position that he had. And Nebuchadnezzar had to learn that the hard way. Well, God has allowed this beast, this empire, to speak great things and blasphemies. Again, the enforcing of these false gods of the Roman and Greek pantheon, the yearly requirement of the citizens of Rome to make a confession of Caesar as Lord, and then receive that certificate that they have met their obligations to Caesar. And these great things and blasphemies that are being referenced, again, goes back to that blasphemous name on his heads. Okay, not necessarily that the heads, each one represents a different empire, but the idea that this kind of fullness of these world empires and what they sought to impose on the populations of people was always the same. It was always idolatrous. It was never Jehovah. And that's part of this blasphemous name of verse 1 or verse 2. All right. Anything through verse 5?
Just in a bigger picture, it's kind of amazing to step back and pause and think, with all the succession of world empires, like you said, trying to impose this, that any sense of faith in Jehovah survived and it was still there throughout and after
That's a great point. That's a great point. You know, God, there has always been a remnant that has served Jehovah acceptably with reverence and godly fear, right? Always. And no matter how much Satan has had control or influence over the empires of the world in trying to fulfill the idolatrous desires that they had, there have always been people willing to do what God wanted them to do. And you're absolutely right. Despite Satan's best efforts, despite Satan constantly trying to threaten, even through the two nations that were supposed to be given to Jehovah, Israel and Judah, which they should have been just one nation, but because of some unwise decisions by one of the kings, they ended up splitting into two. But they were supposed to be serving Jehovah, but ultimately ended up being given over to idols. Israel the whole time, Judah multiple times. And so the fact that you still had people willing to do what God wanted, even when it looked like that there wasn't. What did Elijah have? What did he convince himself of?
He was the only one.
I'm the last one left. There are no more. I'm the only one left. And what did God say in response to that?
Got 3,000 that haven't bowed their knees to Baal.
There are far more than you realize. You don't know everything that I know. And I think Elijah kind of had to be reminded of that God knows those who are his, and there are more than you know that have not bowed the knee to Baal. And so kind of recognizing that throughout all of these world empires, faithful people continued. And the desire to serve Jehovah according to what he commanded continued. Regardless of how many, in terms of number, existed at any one time, it continued. All right, so going on to verse 6, here's some of the specific blasphemies that are coming out. He opened his mouth in blasphemy against God. Now notice there are three things specifically against God that this beast speaks against. He says to blaspheme his name, that's the name of Jehovah, his tabernacle, that's his dwelling place, and those who dwell in heaven. Now, it's really interesting because this is not necessarily specific to any one false god or any one sense of or statement or worship that Rome issued. But it kind of comprises everything that is involved in the worship of Jehovah. His name is what? Jehovah or Yahweh. But remember what Moses or God told Moses to tell the people who he was? I am that I am. The one true and only God, ultimately. I who exist. God wasn't dependent on his existence for anyone. He has always been, always will be. And how multiple times here in Revelation there's this reference to he who was, he who is, and he will always be. Okay, combining past, present, and future. And so this sense in which God and who God is, containing his character, his nature, that is the name of God. That is the name of Jehovah. And by everything that they did in promoting their false gods and in promoting men as gods, their Caesars, that was blaspheming against the name of the one true God. But then the tabernacle. Now notice this isn't in a context of referencing specifically the temple of Jerusalem. Okay, this isn't, and especially to remember the fact that, after Jesus died, was raised, and ascended to heaven, the church was established. Did the temple have any meaning anymore after that? Was that God's tabernacle anymore? No, not anymore. Once the law changed, then the temple was nothing more than a building. The most holy place was nothing more than a place. That's it. It was no longer the tabernacle of God. Remember earlier in Revelation, we talked about this door being opened and being allowed to see kind of this glimpse into the temple, into the tabernacle of Jehovah. Well, that term tabernacle literally means where God dwells. And I would suggest that the difference here of the tabernacle and then those who dwell in heaven is the fact that his place is ascendant. Okay, his place is holy. His place in the heavenlies, okay, not the physical heavenly in the sense, but in the spiritual realm, he is over all. And yet, what did they seek to exalt? They sought to exalt their gods of, the Greeks called it Olympus. right, who lived among the clouds, and yet they were very human in nature, very sinful in nature. And so they kind of spoke against his tabernacle, that spiritual realm. Here they are exalting these false gods to being those in that same realm. And yet, that's not the case. And then those who dwell in heaven. This could be a reference simply to angels and the heavenly host and all that God has created in that sense. It could be reference to, some suggested the idea of worshiping stars and suns. And of course, we know that the Romans, in fact, part of where we get the names of our days, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and so forth, comes from the names of the Roman gods. And they were named after, like, the planets, Jupiter and Mars and so forth. I tend to think that this is more so along the lines of those who have died in faith. Okay, not that they're literally in heaven, because when we die, when our soul dies, if we're faithful unto the Lord, we go to a place, paradise. It's the realm of the dead, and of Hades, which is paradise. But the idea that those who have died, faithful to the Lord, those who have served Him, they are blasphemed in association with speaking against Jehovah, speaking against God. And so all of these, this sense in which everything that the empire did from a religious perspective in promoting their own gods, but then persecuting those who sought to serve the one true God, covers all three of those things. Now, whether or not there's any more to that, those who dwell in heaven, again, whether it's speaking to angels or the way it's phrased, it doesn't really seem like they're not blaspheming the planets and the stars so much as they are naming their gods after them. But I guess you could look at it from the perspective that they blasphemed God's creation. I guess you could look at it that way. But regardless of what specific is being referenced here, it is the sense in which the idolatry that they served did all three of these things. It blasphemed the name of Jehovah, it blasphemed His dwelling place of heaven, and it blasphemed those who dwell in heaven, however you end up taking it. Thoughts or comments through verse 6? Yes, sir.
Could it not be here that the tabernacle of God, it could also be the church?
Yes, it could, but the thing that we go back to from where the tabernacle is introduced to us, and the tabernacle is separate from the church. And this we saw back in chapter 11. Here in verse 2, we see how rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there. And so notice how those who worship there are part of this holy city. Okay, those are the Christians. Whereas the presence of God, that's where they're, I guess you could say the church is kind of that representation. But then notice at the end of Revelation 11, we have verse 19, the temple of God was opened in heaven, and the ark of His covenant was seen in His temple, and there were lightnings, noises, thunderings, and earthquake, and great hail. And so it seems to be more representative of, and certainly you could include the church in this application, but it seems to be more representative of that spiritual realm. Now, in so much as the church, as we connect to Jehovah through the Spirit, absolutely you could include that part as well. But it would seem to be referencing that spiritual component, that spiritual dwelling place of Jehovah, in contrast to here's man trying to put their gods in God's place, so to speak. But you're absolutely right. His tabernacle, you could certainly include the church in that, because the church is being persecuted, and certainly Christians are being blasphemed as well. But it would seem to indicate the spiritual emphasis, as opposed to not necessarily the physical persecution per se. But I think that application could certainly be there.
Well, when you have to go back to where this was, who this was written to.
Yep.
The context of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then that goes back to these saints going through great persecution and knowing that this is what Rome is doing. Okay, they're persecuting the name of our God, they're persecuting His tabernacle and those who dwell in heaven. And again, all three of these symbolize that spiritual aspect that is true and right, in contrast to what the Roman Empire and their beliefs and their idols and their false gods are attempting to kind of impose their views on this. And first of all, God says, I know full well what they're doing, and I know what it is. And the saints knew full well what they were doing and what it was. It's blasphemy. Yeah. Anything else to verse 6?
That's why we have to stay close to God on a daily basis
Yeah.
and know who is in power.
Right.
So we can live in this world and still be able to follow God instead of the earthly kingdom.
Right. Absolutely. And that goes back to Revelation. You know, we talked about before how that Revelation, the principles being applied here in Revelation are not only applicable to the first century saints. Yes, they were going through great persecution, which including being executed if they didn't serve the gods of Rome. But that doesn't change the principles being applied here, which is be faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life, which Jesus promised to the churches of Asia. And that same component of realizing that on a day-to-day basis, even though we may not face the type of persecution they did, we should be living certainly in such a way that we aren't like everybody else, doing the types of things and talking about the types of things that everybody else talks about, especially those sinful things and things that are inappropriate. But especially in our daily lives, the choices, the decisions that we make show who it is we're serving. And whether or not we're serving God, or even by unintentional, the great dragon, through whether it's kingdoms of men or through sin. Anything else to verse 6? Verse 7, it was granted to him. Notice this phrase keeps being added here. It was granted to him, again, this is this beast, this empire of Rome, to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. Now again, these are descriptive terms. It's not the sense in which of a time frame here. It's just the sense in which this is a world empire being described. The very same world empire that would make war with the saints of Daniel 7 is the exact same one referenced here in verse 7, that this is being allowed to happen. And notice it even says, and to overcome them. Now that goes back to chapter 12. Remember how the great dragon, or Satan, because he could not disrupt the plan of Jehovah, what's the only other thing he can do? Hurt his people. That's the only other thing Satan can do. So Satan sought to persecute the saints. And so really what's being described in verse 7 is the very thing we see at the end of chapter 12, where the dragon was enraged in verse 17, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring. Again, we talk about this woman and how it would seem best to fit, whether you look at this as the church or my personal belief is the plan of God. We are the offspring of the plan of God. We keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Well, verse 7 of chapter 13 is this very thing. It's very fulfillment that the dragon went about seeking to do this very thing through whom? Through the Roman Empire. That's how the dragon was seeking to disrupt the plan of God through the saints. And we're even told in verse 7 to overcome them. But does that mean that Satan was able to overcome the plan of God? Or the church, for that matter? No. All right, we'll stop here at verse 7. We will pick up here next week, and we'll probably likely get to the second part of chapter 13. So if you want to pick up those notes, you can do so. Thank you, everybody.